Hello, I'm Bernard Hickey from interest.co.nz and welcome to another in our series of double shot interviews. This is where we grab a couple of cups of coffee, sit down with a chief executive or a minister or someone interesting who's talking about fiscal policy or monetary policy or tax policy or house prices or the economy or stuff we find interesting, and grill them for about 10 minutes. Today we have Gabs Makhlouf here. He's the Deputy Chief Executive of the Treasury. And last week he gave an interesting speech to a Retirement Commission-sponsored conference looking at the issue of retirement. Because last year the Treasury came up with a long-term fiscal outlook which took into account New Zealand's spending habits, our current settings on pension policy, healthcare policy, and worked out that if we didn't change anything, our net public debt would get over 220% of GDP by 2050 or so. Now, Gabs, at the conference you talked about those long-term fiscal projections and how the Treasury had redone the numbers since last year, taking into account the changes that were announced in the budget, the May budget. What did you find when you redid the numbers?
Well, we found two things. One, the number itself has changed. So instead of being 223%, it's now just over 100%, which in some ways sounds great because it's a huge reduction. But the second thing that we found is really just confirmation of what we said last year and what we said in 2006 when we last did this, which is essentially the track we're on is unsustainable in the long term and needs to be addressed.
What's wrong with 100% of GDP?
Well, it's a very big number, and the very, very short answer to it is it's exactly where the Greeks are at the moment, and we all know what challenges they're facing. But if I can just sort of say one thing, what we did was come out with a projection, and it's not a forecast. A projection, and this is quite important for people to know, a projection basically looks at sort of historic trends in spending and projects them forward from the end of our forecast period. So we've got a forecast that we made around budget time up to 2014, and we've taken basically those numbers and projected them forwards. So the important point, I think, and I think we said this last year, is we don't actually think this will happen.
Why is that?
Because we think that governments at the end of the day will need to address the reality of a debt position that is unsustainable. So it's extremely unlikely that governments will just let things happen in the way they could happen and put us in the sort of crisis position that I suppose the Greeks are in.
So what sort of choices are out there for the government and for the public?
The key word is choices, Bernard, because I think at the end of the day, the spending that's going on is driven by choices and choices that governments make, and we've recommended all sorts of things in the past to look at. But I mean, just focusing on last week's conference, which was really looking at hosted by the Retirement Commissioner and the Institute of Policy Studies. I mean, it was focusing on retirement income, and we can see that poses challenges to us already. Basically, at the moment, if I can use a big number, at the moment around 25% of spending goes on social services to the over 65s, and they represent around 13% of the population. By around 2050 we think that'll be 40% of spending, and they'll represent a quarter of the population. So that just gives you a feel of the challenge that we think exists around the sort of over 65 population. Now, you know, the choices that are being debated have been debated, and I know that a number of people made this point at the conference. You could look at the age of eligibility. You could look at issues around whether KiwiSaver can provide some sort of, well, the nature of KiwiSaver can be changed. I mean, the whole debate around compulsory savings. So just in that narrow area around retirement, there's choices. But what we were talking about is the whole spending arena. So health, education. At the end of the day, it's what does the country want to prioritise, and where does it want to spend? But you know, the other side of the coin is growth.
See, that's the other thing that some people say. We don't need to worry too much about this, they say, because, hey, growth will get us out of this problem before we've seen, forecasts of doom and gloom, and we just grew our way out of it. What's to stop us doing that again?
Well, I think the work we did last year and history at the moment is showing us that our levels of growth are just not going to be the silver bullet to answer this. It'll certainly help. And I think growth is extremely important for us, and we need to continue to look at, and the Treasury is very much focused around that, we need to continue to look at ways of improving economic growth. And this ranges from our tax policies, sort of macro policies, looking at issues like migration. But at the end of the day, it won't be enough. The maths just don't add up.
Because, as I understand it, the demography of New Zealand in the next 20, 30 years is that more people will be older, yep, and more people will be retired, which means that even if we get more productivity out of the people who are working, simply because there's less people working compared to those people who are retired or being supported by the state, means that growth isn't enough.
That's right. And we expect, this is one of the points that was being debated last week, we expect people over 65 who at the moment are treated as basically being out of the labour workforce. We expect more people will actually be working. But we don't think, we can debate this point, but we don't think enough people will be working alone to actually solve this problem for us.
Because at the conference there was some debate about this issue of, yep, how many people would be working, and a lot of people say, hey, maybe retired people would actually like to keep working, that, yeah, they want to stay involved in the community and keep contributing, and that one of the solutions to this pensions issue long term is for simply people to work for longer. Is that a solution?
Well, I think that's part of a solution, but I don't think it's the whole solution. And realistically, I think we can. I think it's not unreasonable to expect people to continue to work after 65, but whether they're really going to be working after 75, for example, I think that's a difficult question. And even if they're working, are they going to be as productive as they were 20 years previously? Again, it just seems to me doubtful.
And this seems to be an issue not just for New Zealand, but for a lot of developed economies. And you've come to New Zealand from the UK, where you worked for the Treasury and Inland Revenue. It seems New Zealand has a bit more time up its sleeve, perhaps, than some other developed economies to work with this issue. Is that fair?
Well, I think New Zealand has the same amount of time as everyone else, really, in the sense that some of these challenges are long-term. I mean, there isn't an immediate crisis that people have to fix, but the UK, you talk about the UK has recognised it's got a problem, and it's made some long-term changes. I mean, the age of eligibility in the UK is being raised, but over a pretty long time scale. So they're talking about 68, but this is after 2040. So I think the key thing for us in New Zealand is making those. I mean, I think in my speech I mentioned 6 sort of principles to follow, which are about keeping debt under control, keeping spending under control, focusing on outcomes and growth, focusing on public sector productivity, and a key one is to make early decisions and early change. That doesn't mean, I think, that you need to implement a change tomorrow, but knowing that you've got a problem coming in 2050 and starting to make the choices now, I think that's probably quite important.
Excellent. Well, there we have it. Gabs Makhlouf, the Deputy Chief Executive of the Treasury, talking there about the long-term fiscal outlook. And the speech which he mentioned in our interview is below this video. You can link to it and also to the PDF with all the charts, because we love charts here at interest.co.nz. I'm Bernard Hickey. That was another in our series of double-shot interviews here on interest.co.nz.